I'm going to talk now about an important concept in microeconomics which deals with the relationship between the quantity demanded in equilibrium price and the quantity supplied in equilibrium price, and how nobody's outlawed the law of demand, which says that people will demand various quantities at different prices, and some people are willing to pay higher prices, some are willing to pay lower prices. Whether or not there's availability for those individually lower prices is problematic. And the same goes with nobody's outlawed the law of supply, that there are various prices that sellers are willing to provide goods. But there is a reality, though, of the market equilibrium price, if we believe that price can be achieved in a stable kind of way. So let's take the market for a good, and let's say this is a market for a dinner, $15 per person, and think about what the law of demand is telling us, that everywhere along here there are quantity intercepts that match up with at least the quantity demanded portion of an ordered pair along this continuum here, which means that there are people who are willing to pay a higher price than 15. Maybe there are some people willing to pay 16, maybe there are some willing to pay 19, maybe there are some willing to pay 22, and maybe the absolute maximum for this particular good is 30, and we know that that's sort of a drop-dead price because the quantity at that particular price is 0. So anything below 30, buyers are priced in. So think about this and what this means when we talk about something that we call consumer surplus. Consumer surplus means that for those buyers who are willing and able to pay a price greater than the equilibrium price, that they get extra value that accrues to them, extra value and extra benefit for their particular purchase of the good. Because remember, they had nothing to do necessarily with founding that $15 equilibrium price. The equilibrium price is basically a result of the intersection of demand and supply. But the fact that they're willing to pay a higher price, say $19, is what I would call something of a happy coincidence. And by the way, doesn't this sort of ring home in our own experiences? We go to a store and plan to pay a certain amount of dollars for a good. We find that it's at a lower price than what our feeling was. And we don't go to the cash register and say, you know what, I was willing and able to pay you a higher price, so let me pay you the higher price. Nobody really does that. And so instead, what happens is this entire region here, this entire region that we'll go ahead and shade in here, is what we call consumer surplus, which is simply defined as the value that accrues to those buyers of goods who are willing and able to pay a price greater than the equilibrium price, but don't have to because the equilibrium price is market determined, and so as a result, extra value accrues to them. Now notice if you were only willing to pay something like $10, then you're really out of luck because there is no clearing price, no quantity that will clear at $10, and so you're not priced in here. The minimum price is $15. And in fact, the price that everyone pays is $15, whether you're willing to pay a higher price or a lower price. And as we get deeper into the course, we're going to see cases in which sellers, if they're able to catch on and identify who's willing to pay a higher price, can identify them and in fact charge them that higher price. But that's not always a given. It's not always possible. It's not always possible for McDonald's to know who's willing to pay more for a Big Mac. As a result, there's one price for Big Macs, and that's it. Okay, so for this particular good, some restaurant dinner, $15 is the equilibrium price, and all those folks willing to pay a higher price based upon their income, their preferences, their unique benefit that they get from the good, they benefit in that case. Okay? Also, the concept of surplus works on the other side as well, because the price of the good that is willing to be accepted by the supply side is 15. But yet notice this, you've got all these different quantities that can be available at all these different prices, and isn't that what a supply curve is? The law of supply says that there are various quantities that are directly related to the amount of price that's being earned in the market. So as a result, there are all kinds of different quantities that correspond to different prices. And so think about this. This means that there are some sellers of a good who are willing to collect $8, who are willing to collect 10, who are willing to collect 11, 13. So think about this. If you're willing to charge $8 for the good, you're certainly willing to charge 10. And if you're willing to charge 10, you're willing to charge 11. And as you do it, you'll ramp up your production of the good, because that's what the law of supply tells us. And if you're willing to take 13, you'll definitely take 15. And so as a result, this entire shaded region here is what we refer to as producer surplus, simply defined as the value that accrues to the supply side those sellers who are willing and able to sell at a price less than the equilibrium price. And again, if you're a seller and you think you can sell your good at 11, you'll do that. But if it turns out you can get it for 15, you'll do that as well. And notice there was some drop-dead point here, just as there was at the intercept on the p-axis over here, where there's a very minimum price that the seller will provide goods. And I'll just say it's $5. That is the quantity of that, because we're at the intercept, the quantity is 0. There is no production of good at $5. And when that happens, nobody produces goods. And as a result, we see some long-term adjustments that we'll also cover a bit later in the semester. So this idea of surpluses can actually be measured in terms of value. That, think about what this is. If you took this configuration, this triangle, and I drew this deliberately with straight lines so that we have a nice right triangle. If you just stood this up on its side here, you'd have something like this, which is a right triangle. And what is the area inside a right triangle? In other words, the area of the shaded region. Well, we know from geometry it's 1/2 of the base times the height. And if we simply call this the base and this the height, and let's say we have some value of quantity, we'll just call it 100 here, then it's really a very simple matter for us to find out what the area of that is. So it's 1/2 times the base, which is this distance here between 30 and 15, 30 minus 15, times the height, which is 100. Okay? And then it's a relatively simple matter to solve the math. We'll solve inside this parentheses here. We have 15 times 100. And we can sort of do this in our head. 15 times 100 is 1,500 times 1/2, which is 750. 750 what? $750. And the reason we know it's dollars is because the base is denominated in dollars, even while the quantity is denominated in units. And one thing that we know, and it's a rule of thumb to be aware of everywhere in economics, whenever you have a dollar figure multiplied or divided by a number, it's always going to be a dollar figure. So for instance, if I work 10 hours and I get paid $10 per hour, I said I've earned $100. I don't denominate in any other particular way. And so it's important, and economists in the real world actually do, when the data is good enough to allow this, actually do these calculations in order to determine what the area is. What is the shaded region? Because this is a two-dimensional space here. We can actually get the measurement on that. And the same goes with producer surplus. We can do the math here as well. And if you wanted to, you can do that. In this case, because we're talking about the area of this demand curve and how it comes up against the equilibrium price and the p-axis, we can simply say the consumer surplus is equal to 1/2 base times height. And as a result, consumer surplus is equal to $750. And one of the things that is a real-life application that economists will do is to try to find instances in which there's a great imbalance between consumer surplus and producer surplus. In other words, where the value lies on either side of the market, and attempt to explain why that is. And perhaps regulation can be brought into the picture in order to improve the outcome, whatever that desired outcome should be. Okay, one final thing I want to do here, and it's related to some of this material, and that is, we're assuming that we're in equilibrium condition with regard to both consumer and producer surplus. And I want to look at a situation in which we are not in equilibrium for whatever reason. And because we're not in equilibrium, the market is out of that short-term condition of balance. And so what does that look like, and what are the implications? And so think about this. We'll go back to just the generic description of the market model, in other words, the PQ plane. And again, it's useful to think of these as just being rays that go on forever. And we've got a condition where we have a demand curve looking something like this, downward sloping, and a supply curve looking something like this, upward sloping. And as a result, we have some equilibrium condition of price, equilibrium price here. And for right now, we're not interested in actual values, just to know where these are, and an equilibrium quantity here. And what was it we said about equilibrium quantity? Before we said about equilibrium quantity was that there are no surpluses and no shortages. No surpluses and no shortages. That's what an equilibrium quantity represents. No surpluses, no shortages. Well, what about a conditions out of equilibrium? So for instance, what about a case in which suppliers are not producing the equilibrium quantity, they're producing somewhere out here? And so as a result of this, think about this. The sellers are producing this much quantity, but there is not that much quantity demanded at that particular quantity. And so what happens? This is a condition in which we're out of equilibrium. And again, it's easy just to visualize the out of equilibrium condition because we're not here. We're not at the intersection between between demand and supply. So in this case, this is simply a surplus condition. And a surplus simply being defined as a case in which the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied. And what has to happen in this particular situation of being out of equilibrium is the idea that at some point the equilibrium will have to get worked off. And so think about what happens. Think about any producer or groups of producers who have produced too much output. They've got to dial it down, and oftentimes it all must go. You know, you've kind of heard that kind of thing. They'll be producing less output. And I'll just look at this as being primarily, in this case, a supply issue. There could be demand issues as well, but I think it's easier to sort of envision this being a supply issue, and I'll sort of treat it as that. At some point we'll work our way back to equilibrium, this point here, where there is no surplus and no shortage. And so the surplus is oftentimes considered to be a temporary condition. In this case, it's caused by simply an overproduction of goods. And as a result, sellers need to get rid of the output, need to dial it down, and then any new purchases, and so they also bring the price down as well. Well, what about the other kind of condition? What about a condition here where, let's say, suppliers are underproducing and you've got this kind of thing happening? Well, this is also out of equilibrium because we're now at the intersection of demand and supply. And so think about what's going on here. There's an underproduction, and we'll look at this as primarily a supply function for now. Certainly there are demand elements in both surpluses and shortages, but nonetheless, let's just say that it's a supply issue. Not enough is being produced. In other words, there's a scarcity of the good, and buyers would actually pay a higher price for more quantity. Well, this out of equilibrium condition is simply a shortage, which is simply defined just the opposite of the surplus. It's where quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. So as a result, if I'm a seller trying to cure this shortage condition, I would do well to ramp up my availability of the good. And also, if demand is absolutely overwhelming, goods are flying off shelves, people can't get enough of them, well then that's a signal to raise the price. And as I raise the price and as I dial up the amount of production, the quantity, the volume quantity, I get back to equilibrium. And so we see these conditions happening periodically where shortages and surpluses exist, and it further proves to us why equilibrium is a much more common condition than not, because in most markets we don't see an overwhelming surplus or an overwhelming shortage, and when we do, it's usually a short-term condition. So I hope that this was helpful in illustrating what some of the realities are behind equilibrium, both in terms of their creation of surpluses, both for the consumer as well as producers, and also what happens when there's an out of equilibrium condition that happens for various reasons. And again, feel free to contact me individually if you'd like to discuss further.